In the 2010s, life didn't just feel easier, it felt accessible. Fashion, pop culture, music, and the early rise of social media all collided into one atmosphere that felt open in a way we haven't seen since. Fashion was still fun, still colorful. It wasn't overly intellectualized yet, and most importantly, it didn't feel locked behind institutions. There was room to enter, room to experiment, room to exist. What I call this moment is the era of possibility. Because for the first time in a long time, fashion didn't feel like it belonged to magazines, luxury houses, or gatekeepers. It felt like it belonged to people, real people.
You want to talk about your own aesthetic, but sometimes it's like almost off limits.
Yeah.
Because it's too obvious, slash, like, also there's another thing too. It's like people that are referencing it don't really say that they're referencing it.
Right.
You know what I mean? It's just like, well, someone outside of that person that we were talking about should say it because they know him or her to do that.
Casting started to change. Bodies started to change. Faces started to change. And black creatives weren't just being included. They were actively shaping what fashion looked like in real time.
I was sort of looking at the freedom within acknowledging the constraints and realizing what holds you down and what may have a hold of you. And I think that that's like the first step to becoming free.
It's interesting that you feel something political about this show because we don't think anything political in fashion anymore.
How he thinks, and I'm like, he just nailed it. Just the accessories, the leather gloves, like the garters, but for like your hands.
What does that say to you?
I'm free.
If all along the premise of HBA has been freedom, to introduce so much restraint into this collection was really a very, very powerful counterpoint.
I saw, I think, some of the best American fashion I've maybe ever.
Shane Oliver is a New York-born designer and creative force who redefined fashion in the early 2010s through his brand Hood by Air. Emerging from black, queer, and club culture, Oliver didn't just introduce new silhouettes. He emerged a new attitude. His work challenged who fashion was for, who it centered, and whose bodies were allowed to take up space. Through Hood by Air, Shane created a visual language rooted in nightlife, sexuality, aggression, and vulnerability, what many now recognize as ghetto gothic. The runways felt raw, confrontational, and real, populated by everyday people rather than polished ideals. Between 2010 and 2016, Hood by Air became the uniform of fashion's most experimental era, influencing casting, styling, and the direction of global streetwear and luxury fashion. What I always found interesting and something nobody really talks about is how the 2010s Tumblr scene and its aesthetics are directly connected to Shane Oliver and the rise of Hood by Air. That wave didn't just influence fashion, it shifted the energy of the entire industry. It proved that mainstream fashion conversations no longer belong only to luxury houses or traditional gatekeepers, but to real people, real bodies, and the real culture. Hood by Air made it clear that visibility didn't have to be polished, respectable, or filtered through European approval to matter. It showed that black queer street-rooted expression could exist at the center of fashion, not on the margins, and that changed everything. But when you really think about it, for better or for worse, everything was open. And when I say everything, I mean everything behind the scenes. The doors of the fashion industry were wide open and access was everywhere, maybe a little too everywhere. Boutique casting agencies like Midland were suddenly on the forefront in demand. The look and feel of everyday people wasn't just accepted, it was being advertised. Faces that felt familiar, bodies that felt real. It almost mirrored the 90s in that way. Raw, authentic, and unpolished. Fashion shows felt fun to go to again. it actually felt possible to be cast. And the Tumblr girl or guy you followed for aesthetics a few years earlier was now walking on the runway. And not because they fit a traditional standard, but because they already was representing what culture looked like. Rihanna debuting Fenty only pushed this further. She didn't just launch a beauty brand, she opened an entirely new lane for models, for makeup artists, for creators who had never been centered before. Faces like Slick Woods, Leomi Anderson, and Ducky Thought became household names with career runs that genuinely resembled 90s supermodels, just happening in real time, online, and in front of us. And this is where it gets interesting, because with all that access came a cost that I'll get into soon. But when we think about why 2016 felt so relatable, we have to ask ourselves why. Why did it feel so close to us? Why did it feel like we could see ourselves in fashion again? And most importantly, we gotta realize and ask ourselves this. What happens after recognition? What comes after access? Was the industry simply banking on the moment like it always does? Or does this era reveal something way much deeper? A moment where diversity wasn't just a strategy yet, but a reality the industry had to study before something much sinister came.
This new style is about surviving in a violent, disgusting planet. Fashion should express this opposition to the future. We don't want this future, they're saying us.
Were we predicting our own destiny? Or were we just ahead of the curve? Before darkness fully took over fashion? Because when you really look back, Shane Oliver and Hood by Air weren't just creating an aesthetic. They were capturing a moment where Black queer youth weren't being filtered or softened. They were loud, they were confrontational, and unapologetically present. Maybe Shane was ahead of his time, but what's interesting is how quickly that same era transformed into something much more sanitized, much more white. We've seen this before. The 1990s was diverse, expressive, and culturally loud. And then the 2000s came, and suddenly fashion went quiet, thin, and Eurocentric. That same pattern was repeated because after 2016, darkness didn't just enter the industry, it took over it. And the same doors that once felt wide open slowly started to close again. What's ironic is that same very aesthetic Shane Oliver and his peers built at Hood by Air, the aggression, the repetition, the severity, the uniform, began reappearing through European fashion houses. Designers like Demna Gvasalia didn't invent this energy, but they benefited from where it landed.
Talk to me about the fit from head to toe.
Man, Balenci, goddammit, Balenci, goddammit, Balenci, goddammit. Water, man.
Dom's is dancing, man. What's your favorite season to get dressed? Summer, spring, winter, fall?
All season.
Best part about
we do this shit all year round.
Balenciaga hit the mainstream not just in fashion, but in hip-hop culture specifically. The brand became synonymous with status, identity, and seriousness. That dark, duplicated, almost clone aesthetic became luxury streetwear's new uniform. And with that came something deeper, an identity shift. Clone culture became fashionable, sameness became aspirational. European minimalism absorbed the rawness that once came from the real bodies and real subcultures that made it. And this is where the distinction matters. Rick Owens has always designed in a dark, stripped-down, anti-glam lane. That's true. His work in the 90s and early 2000s was deeply personal, rooted in his own mythology and body politics. But it was subcultural. It wasn't defining youth culture at scale. It wasn't reshaping casting. It wasn't opening doors. Hood by Air wasn't about silhouette alone. It was about who was centered, who was allowed to exist loudly in luxury spaces, what bodies were visible, what energy entered the room. Hood by Air made casting feel confrontational and real. It turned nightlife, blackness, and queerness into the runway itself. That's influence, not the drape, but the presence. So no, this isn't just about saying Rick Owens or Demna stole anything. This is also about understanding power dynamics. When Hood by Air burned bright and then faded from the center, after Shane won the CFDA award for menswear in 2015 and in 2016, the industry didn't let that energy go. It absorbed it. It muted it, reframed it as European innovation, and then redirected the credit and capital back to the designers who were already institutionally protected. Hood by Air didn't invent the darkness. It redefined who the darkness belonged to. And once the industry understood that, it decided who could carry it forward. So when people ask, why fashion feels repetitive now? Why everything feels dark but empty? Why luxury streetwear looks expensive but says nothing? This is why. The industry didn't evolve. It extracted. It took the risk, the bodies, the urgency, and the cultural tension out of that movement and kept its shell. And that's the part that doesn't get talked about enough. Because diversity during that era wasn't marketing, it was a reality. These weren't perfectly polished models hired to represent difference. These were real people pulled straight from the city, straight from the nightlife, Tumblr, from the streets, and once the industry learned what that access could produce, it didn't keep the door open. It studied it, copied it, then closed it. So understand, when we talk about 2010s fashion, the year 2016 is especially important and it should be studied because that was the moment when access, visibility, and culture briefly aligned. And at the center of that alignment was Shane Oliver and Hood by Air. And when we talk about the designer Shane Oliver and his brand Hood by Air specifically, we're not dissecting a trend that came and went. We're examining a rupture, a moment that showed what fashion looks like when the people shaping it actually come from the culture, instead of borrowing it from the outside. The real question isn't whether that level of access will come back. It's whether the industry will ever let it happen again, but without controlling it. And as this pattern has continued over the last 5 to 6 years, we've watched designers like Demna Gvasalia and Rick Owens heavily profit from the cultural groundwork Shane Oliver laid. The fashion industry gave Shane credit, but what they didn't give him was control. They didn't give him access to fully live inside his own legacy, to expand it, to protect it, or to carry it forward on his own terms. Instead, the industry copied the energy, sanitized it, and redistributed it in a way that felt safer for them. And that's the sad part. Shane never really got the chance to see how his vision could truly translate across other fashion houses. His short run at Helmet Lane proves that point. It wasn't a lack of talent, it was a lack of institutional trust. And that's something black designers run into over and over and over again. So what we're learning here is that black American contributions are consistently extracted, reframed, and credited elsewhere, while the originators are pushed to the margins once the culture becomes profitable. So yeah, all along, those TikTok kids were probably right, y'all. 2016 was definitely important to this culture. And if we're being honest, it's on to us to remember where these aesthetics actually came from and to relearn the parts of fashion history that were hidden from us on purpose. My name is DJ Selby. Thank you for coming to Cloud Negative 9. Make sure you like, comment, and subscribe so we can keep supporting, documenting, and telling the truth about Black American experiences within the fashion industry. I'm out, and I'm going to catch y'all in the next episode. Peace.